Hello, everybody, and welcome to the National Paralegal College Faculty's Legal Analysis of the News. My name is Stephen Haas, and today we're going to discuss a fresh news story about the Iran nuclear deal. The deal, which was just struck yesterday on July 14th, is a deal between Iran and many of the world powers, especially and including the United States, regarding Iran's nuclear program. In exchange for agreeing to certain conditions about their nuclear program, Iran will have the sanctions against them, the economic sanctions that have been crippling their economy for a few years, lifted. Now, this is a fairly complex deal. You can see this guide from the New York Times. This is just the first part of it. It goes on and on and on for about 10 pages explaining the deal, and this is just a simple guide. You can imagine what a complex guide would look like. But what I want to discuss is really more of the procedural aspect here. What exactly is the Congress's role in approving this deal? What is the president's role? And exactly what can Congress do? Because there's been a lot of confusion about that in the media in the last day or two. When it comes to dealing with foreign affairs, the Constitution of the United States gives the major power to the President of the United States, with Congress having only an ancillary role. For example, this is Section 2 of Article 2 of the United States Constitution, and it says, among other things, that the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, and, more germane to our discussion, is that he shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided by that two-thirds of the senators present concur. And then there are some other powers in this section that are not really relevant to us. The point is, the only thing that the Constitution says about making agreements with foreign powers is that the President can make treaties, but that the treaties have to garner two-thirds of the support of the Senate. Now, although the Constitution doesn't specifically say this, there is also a recognized right of the President to make an executive agreement with another power. Here are some examples of the distinctions and similarities between treaties and just regular executive agreements. Presidents can negotiate treaties and executive agreements, the difference being that treaties are agreements with other countries that require Senate approval, and executive agreements do not require Senate approval. The Constitution, in fact, does not specifically say anything about executive agreements. If the President of the United States agrees with the Prime Minister of Canada regarding fishing for tuna fish off the coast of Maine and New Brunswick, well, then the President can make that agreement. If it is ratified by Congress, in other words, confirmed by two-thirds of the Senate, then it is considered a treaty. Otherwise, it is considered an executive agreement. The only difference procedurally between the two is that the treaty is ratified by the Senate and the executive agreement is not. So, you may ask, well then why bother with a treaty? Why not just always use executive agreements? Well, the answer is that treaties are binding and are considered federal law, whereas executive agreements are not binding over other federal law. Treaties can repeal and replace previously passed federal law, whereas executive agreements, while they're still binding on the country itself, do not displace other federal law. So, for example, a treaty can repeal and replace and overcome a previously inconsistent federal law, whereas an executive agreement has to comply with all previously passed federal laws. Now, treaties are a lot less common and executive agreements a lot more common recently than previously. A 2009 study found that 53% of international agreement were executive agreements until 1889, but since then that's been almost 95%. And the idea, generally, foreign policy and military maneuvers have become a lot more informal recently. Just another example that's a fairly famous example, the United States has not actually declared war since World War II, whereas, of course, the United States has engaged in many military situations since then. The idea in general is that the president has taken a much more informal and powerful role and kind of cut out the role of Congress a little bit, and this applies to all presidents, not just the current president. So that begs the question, why bother having a treaty when you can just as easily, or almost just as easily, make an executive agreement? Now, aside from the difference that we discussed a moment ago, that an executive agreement is not binding over other federal law, there are also political reasons. to not just use the executive agreement. For example, executive agreements, as you can see from this article, have their weaknesses. An example was when the Clinton administration cut a deal with North Korea over its nuclear program, and many lawmakers, many senators and congressmen, got very upset over the idea that Congress was being completely cut out of the process. And partially because of these political realities, and maybe to strengthen the agreement itself, when President Obama was negotiating the deal with Iran, that was disclosed recently, early in the process, the president went to Congress to get authorization. Similar thing very often happens when the president wants to send the military somewhere, even though he may not technically have to. He very often goes to Congress to get permission. For example, the authorization for use of military force in Iraq, and several other examples. Now, this deal was struck back in April, in the middle of April. Congress and the White House struck a deal on Iran legislation. The legislation itself was bipartisan legislation. Bob Corker, who you see pictured over there, was the Republican representative. Bob Menendez, a senator from New Jersey, was the Democratic representative. And that legislation, which is what we're going to look at in a few minutes, is really what prevents, or has prevented, President Obama from simply establishing this deal by executive agreement. And this was brought up in an article in yesterday's Washington Post, and it refers to this deal struck back in April as the only reason Iran, so far, and even after yesterday's agreement, is not a done deal. And part of this article says, under a new law signed by President Obama earlier this year, which was in April, Congress now has 60 days to review any nuclear deal with Iran. And the 60-day clock starts at the time that certain reports and certifications are given to Congress. This, another part of the article, points out that it's worth remembering that Congress would have no say whatsoever if not for the Corker-Menendez legislation. Without that rule, a deal with Iran simply could have been done by executive agreement. Obviously, it wouldn't be signed as treaty. So the treaty requires 2/3 of the Senate, and frankly, it's probably impossible for any deal with Iran to get 2/3 of the Senate. So let's take a look at that legislation and then discuss what the path from here on out of this deal with Iran is going to be. So let's take a look at the relevant legislation. The relevant legislation was originally introduced back in February by Senator Corker. Later, after a little bit of negotiation, it became law under a new bill, H.R. 1191, entitled the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015. This was represented or introduced by Representative Lou Barletta, and this is what eventually became law. So let's take a look at some of the relevant provisions. This is actually a direct quote, a bunch of direct quotes from the legislation. And what it requires is that within 5 days after reaching an agreement with Iran, the president is required to transmit to Congress basically the agreement, including a very interesting point over here. The president is required to give to Congress a certification, in other words, a guarantee, that the agreement meets U.S. non-proliferation objectives, does not jeopardize the common defense and security, provides a framework to ensure Iran's nuclear activities will not constitute an unreasonable defense and security risk, and ensures that Iran's permitted nuclear activities will not be used to further any nuclear-related military or nuclear explosive purpose. Interesting that this not only requires the president to give the bill to Congress, it requires the president to tell Congress, hey Congress, this deal is safe. This deal will not be used to allow Iran to go out and get a nuclear weapon. And then it gives the president various procedural requirements within 10 days of any significant breach of compliance with the incident. Congress can act. And then every half a year, the president is required to report to Congress on Iran's nuclear compliance. It gives a whole bunch of procedural requirements. Every 90 days, the president has to determine and certify to Congress that Iran is implementing the agreement, hasn't committed any material breach of the agreement, etc., etc., etc. In fact, even this one, Iran has not directly supported or carried out an act of terrorism. And that suspension of sanctions. Iran has been under sanctions by the United States and other countries for years now, and part of this deal is to lift those sanctions. And one of the things that the president has to do to Congress every 3 months is that the president has to go to Congress and say suspension of the sanctions is appropriate and is proportionate to measures taken by Iran to terminate its nuclear program. Interestingly, the president, of course, agreed to this. The president signed this legislation. This was passed with broad bipartisan support by both parties. The president signed this into law. And that, of course, pretty much restricts, or partially restricts, what the president can do. Without this agreement, the president probably could have, or without this legislation, the president probably just could have gone and done an executive agreement and left Congress out of the equation completely. But to garner political support and to give the impression that Congress was involved, the president agreed to this legislation. The real question is, what about consequences? If the president has a bunch of reporting requirements, president has to do this, that, and the other thing, well, what if Congress doesn't agree with the president's analysis? What if Congress thinks that lifting the sanctions is a bad idea? Well, that bill says as follows. That bill says if the president does not submit such 90-day compliance certification, or has determined that Iran has materially breached the agreement and not cured it, legislation reinstating statutory sanctions introduced within 60 calendar days shall be entitled to expedited consideration. In other words, if Congress believes that the president has not made an appropriate compliance with this legislation, well, then then Congress can, in an expedited manner, reintroduce sanctions, which of course would be the linchpin of this agreement. So as you can see, while the Corker-Menendez legislation that eventually got passed into law has restrictions and requirements of the president, the major issue with that legislation is that Congress has to act in order to enforce it. In other words, if Congress believes that there's some sort of a violation, or if the president doesn't comply, or if Congress doesn't think it's a good idea, which is really the issue that's being bandied about right now in the headlines, Congress has to pass some sort of legislation to stop it. It could be expedited, but Congress would have to pass legislation, for example, to reinstate the sanctions that were earlier imposed on Iran. And the thing with legislation is that legislation can be vetoed. This is true with anything that Congress does. Anything that Congress passes can be vetoed by the President of the United States. So the issue here, this comes from, I believe, the Wall Street Journal site, this headline: Republicans may oppose the Iran deal, but can they override a veto? For example, if Congress doesn't like, or a majority of Congress does not like the deal, well, they can pass legislation reimposing sanctions, thereby nullifying the deal. But what if the president vetoes that legislation? And in fact, the president has promised to do so. In this article, the president renewed his vow to veto any such legislation and urged lawmakers to consider the repercussions of their actions, etc. Now, overriding a veto is not so simple. Overriding a veto requires 2/3 of both houses. In the Senate, for example, Republicans control 54 seats, but 67 seats would be required to override a presidential veto. For example, if Congress passes reinstatement of the sanctions against Iran in order to try to nullify the agreement, well, the president could veto it, and then it would have to go back to Congress, and Congress, in order to override that veto, would need 67 votes, and there are 54 Republicans. So even if 54 Republicans would all vote to override the president's veto, you would still need 13 Democrats out of the 46 to agree with overriding it. Same thing is true in the House of Representatives. You would also need, I think there are 247 Republicans in the House, but to override the veto, 2/3 of the House is 290, which means you'd need over 40 more Democrats to agree, or approximately, I don't remember the exact numbers, but approximately 40 Democrats would have to cross party lines and vote to override the president's veto. So essentially, even with the Corker-Menendez legislation, and even with this comprehensive series of very unusual and intrusive responsibilities on the president that the president signed into law back in April or back in May or whenever it was, all he really needs in order to make this deal stick is 1/3 of one house of Congress. If, unless 2/3 of both houses of Congress vote to override his veto, there's not really a whole lot that Congress can do to undo this legislation. The legislation that was passed back in April is really more about reporting requirements and transparency, so to speak, but it probably doesn't do a whole lot to stop the president from making this agreement with Iran actually stick. So it will be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of months and to see whether the opponents of this deal can kill it or whether the proponents of this deal will make it stick. We'll see what happens. If you have any comments, please feel free to put them below. I'll certainly look at them and try to respond to them. And thank you very much for listening. For National Paralegal College Faculty Legal Analysis of the News, this is Stephen Haas. Have a wonderful day, everybody.